He married a quiet, humble woman to inherit a fortune, but she was the heiress they tried to bury. The night sky stretched endlessly above, a canvas of stars shimmering over the Blackwood estate. The grand ballroom, adorned with crystal chandeliers and opulent floral arrangements, was abuzz with the murmurs of high society. Yet amidst the grandeur, a palpable tension lingered. Claire stood at the entrance, her silhouette framed by the golden light spilling from within. Her eyes, a deep shade of emerald, scanned the room with a calm intensity. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Ethan Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood fortune, adjusted. His cufflinks, his expression a mask of indifference. He had agreed to this marriage out of obligation, a stipulation in his late grandfather's will. The terms were clear: remain married for 1 year and 1 day to gain full control of the family empire. Love was irrelevant. Duty was paramount. He glanced at Claire, noting her composed demeanor. As Claire approached, the room fell silent. Her gown, simple yet elegant, contrasted sharply with the extravagance around her. Whispers rippled through the crowd, speculating about the mysterious bride. She offered no smiles, only a nod of acknowledgement. Her presence was both serene and unsettling. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the hall. Ethan recited his vows with practiced ease, his tone devoid of emotion. Claire's turn came, and she spoke with quiet conviction, her words laced with an unspoken promise. Their hands touched briefly, a spark of something unidentifiable passing between them. The moment was fleeting, yet significant. Applause erupted as they were pronounced husband and wife. Ethan offered his arm, which Claire accepted with grace. They walked down the aisle, a picture-perfect couple in a not-so-perfect union. Photographers captured the moment, flashes illuminating their path. Behind their composed facades, both harbored secrets. At the reception, guests indulged in gourmet delicacies and fine wine. Ethan mingled with acquaintances, his charm on full display. Claire, however, remained on the periphery observing. She noted the dynamics, the alliances, the undercurrents of power. Her gaze often drifted to the grand staircase leading to the upper floors. Margot Blackwood, Ethan's mother, approached Claire with a forced smile. "Welcome to the family," she said, her tone icy. Claire met her gaze, unflinching. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood," she replied, her voice steady. An unspoken challenge passed between them. Jacob, Ethan's younger brother, observed the exchange from a distance. He was intrigued by Claire's composure, her ability to hold her own against Margot. There was more to her than met the eye. He made a mental note to learn more about his new sister-in-law. Curiosity piqued. He sipped his drink thoughtfully. Later, Ethan and Claire retreated to the study for a private moment. The room, lined with bookshelves and antique furniture, exuded old-world charm. Ethan poured himself a drink, offering one to Claire, who declined. "So, Mrs. Blackwood," he began, "how does it feel to be married into royalty?" His sarcasm was evident. Claire met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "It's merely a change in title," she replied. "Titles don't define people." Ethan smirked, intrigued by her response. He was used to deference, not defiance. This marriage might prove more interesting than he anticipated. As the evening progressed, Claire excused herself, claiming fatigue. Instead of retiring to their shared suite, she wandered the halls, drawn to the mansion's history. She paused before a portrait of Elizabeth Blackwood, Ethan's great-aunt, who had vanished decades ago. Claire studied the painting, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She whispered, "I'm here, just as you were." Meanwhile, Ethan remained in the study, lost in thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that Claire was hiding something. Her calm demeanor, her probing eyes. It was as if she knew more about his family than she let on. He resolved to keep a close watch on her. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. In her room, Claire opened a small, worn notebook. Inside were notes, sketches, and a family tree, with the Blackwood name prominently featured. She traced a line, connecting Elizabeth to another name, her mother's. A tear slid down her cheek as she whispered, "For you, Mother." The past was not forgotten. It was her guiding force. The night deepened, the estate settling into silence. Yet, within its walls, secrets stirred, old wounds ached, and new alliances formed. Claire lay awake, her mind racing with plans. Ethan, in his own room, stared at the ceiling, questions swirling. Their journey, the morning after the wedding, was bathed in soft golden light, but the warmth did little to thaw the distance between the newlyweds. Ethan sat at the breakfast table, sipping coffee and scrolling through market updates, barely acknowledging Claire. She entered quietly, her steps light, but her presence filled the room like a subtle storm on the horizon. He looked up briefly, offered a nod, and returned to his screen. She said nothing, took a seat across from him, and began eating with poised silence. The tension was tangible. Two strangers sharing a table bound by paper, not by sentiment. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, saw no use in pretending. Claire, meanwhile, observed everything. His watch, his neatly combed hair, the furrow in his brow, as he read a headline. She wasn't here to win his heart, only to uncover a truth buried beneath layers of privilege and deception. Still, something about his indifference unsettled her. It reminded her too much of another man from long ago, one who'd betrayed everything. Margot Blackwood entered the room without knocking, her voice cutting through the silence like glass. "Good morning, dears. I trust your first night as husband and wife was illuminating?" Claire raised, her eyes meeting Margot's with polite stillness. "It was quiet," she answered simply. Ethan didn't bother to respond. Margot, unfazed, smiled with a predator's elegance. She turned her gaze toward Claire, and for the briefest moment, her mask slipped, just enough for Claire to notice the disdain beneath. After breakfast, Claire wandered the estate grounds, drawn by the haunting beauty of the Blackwood mansion. Her footsteps led her to the east wing, where dust coated the marble floor and time seemed to hang heavy in the air. She opened a door to a dimly lit room filled with aged tomes and forgotten letters. The Blackwood Library. Something in her stirred. She moved toward the shelves with reverence, her fingers brushing the spines as if greeting old friends. Here, secrets waited. Jacob Blackwood watched her from the hall. His curiosity, unlike his brother's guarded suspicion, was gentle, even admiring. Claire reminded him of a shadow he couldn't quite place, familiar but elusive. He stepped into the room and cleared his throat. She turned calmly, not startled. "You read?" he asked, gesturing toward the book she held. "I do," she replied, "especially about families who think they have no flaws." Jacob smiled faintly, intrigued. "Then you'll enjoy ours. We're an encyclopedia of dysfunction." Their conversation was brief but revealing. Jacob noted her careful choice of words, the way she neither praised nor condemned. Claire had the air of someone who'd seen too much to speak lightly. She excused herself, slipping a small leather-bound journal into her coat. Jacob didn't stop. Her. He simply watched her go, a question forming quietly in his mind. Who exactly was Claire before she became a Blackwood? Later that evening, Ethan confronted Claire in the drawing room. "You're quite the explorer," he said, voice edged with sarcasm. "First day and you've already found the forgotten wing." Claire didn't flinch. "A house reveals its soul through what it hides." Ethan studied her, frustrated by her calm, unnerved by her insight. "Just don't get too comfortable," he warned. "This isn't a fairy tale, and you're not. Here to play historian. Claire tilted her head. No, I'm not. I'm here to remember. Margot, hidden behind a velvet curtain, listened intently to every word. Her instincts had rarely failed her, and something about Claire was deeply off-script. She made a mental note to have the staff report back on Claire's movements. The past was dangerous in the wrong hands, especially hands like Claire's, quiet, composed, and clearly searching. The game had begun, and Margot wasn't one to lose. That night, Claire returned to the library alone. She had waited until the house quieted, until even the shadows seemed asleep. A certain shelf had caught her eye earlier, one filled with estate records and personal journals dating back generations. She found what she was looking for, a ledger, unassuming but too pristine to belong. Inside were records, initials, dates, and symbols. Symbols her mother had once drawn in the margins of bedtime stories. Back in his study, Ethan stared at his wedding photo. Something about Claire's eyes unsettled him, not because they were cold, but because they were familiar. It struck him that he had seen them before, not in memory, but in a dream. A forest, a storm, a voice calling his name. He shook the thought off. He didn't believe in omens. Still, he poured another drink, the taste bitterer than usual. Jacob sat alone in his room, flipping through a photo album from years past. Picture of Elizabeth Blackwood caught his eye. Her smile was hauntingly similar to Claire's. He leaned closer, heart beginning to race. The resemblance wasn't slight, it was undeniable. He picked up his phone but hesitated. Who would believe? Him, who wanted to believe. Claire lit a candle beside her bed and opened the journal she had taken. Scrawled across the inside cover was a name, E. Blackwood. The handwriting was delicate, full of flourishes, but there was strength behind every letter. Claire traced it with her finger, whispering the name aloud. Elizabeth. Her breath trembled. This was her first real thread, and she wouldn't let it go. Outside, a storm began to brew, unseasonal and sudden. Lightning flashed against the windows, illuminating the darkened halls. The Blackwood mansion creaked and groaned, as if remembering something it would rather forget. Ethan looked toward the sky with unease. Jacob kept flipping pages, searching for more. And Claire, in her room, finally allowed herself to cry, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The reading of Arthur Blackwood's will took place in the mansion's oldest parlor, a room cloaked in heavy drapes and centuries of secrets. The lawyer, a wiry man with trembling hands, unfolded the crisp document as the family gathered in strained silence. Ethan leaned back in his chair, visibly disinterested, while Margot sat poised, like a queen guarding her throne. Claire, quiet as ever, took a seat near the fireplace, eyes fixed on the ornate moulding above her. She already knew what was coming. The stipulation shocked no one, but it still sliced through the room like a blade. Ethan Blackwood shall inherit full control of Blackwood Holdings, only upon remaining legally and physically married to Claire Blackwood for the period of 1 year and 1 day, the lawyer read aloud. Gasps echoed softly. Even Jacob's brow furrowed. Ethan's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Claire didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, not mockingly, but with the kind of calm that unnerves predators. Afterward, Ethan confronted the lawyer in private. "This is ridiculous," he hissed. "My grandfather couldn't have seriously believed a forced marriage would preserve the company." The lawyer, pale and sweating, nodded meekly. "He believed it would force you to slow down, reconnect. He said Claire was part of the legacy." Ethan froze. "What do you mean, part of the legacy?" The lawyer faltered, then said, "Ask your mother." Ethan stormed off. Meanwhile, Claire walked alone through the winter garden, her breath visible in the frosty air. Her mind wasn't on the will, it was on the number. 1 year and 1 day. Her mother had once whispered that phrase on her deathbed, fragile lips forming the words, They bound her for a year and a day. Don't let them do it again. At the time, Claire thought it the fevered rambling of a dying woman. Now she wasn't so sure. Margot approached her shortly after, as if summoned by fate. "You must be pleased," she said sweetly. "Now that your position is secured." Claire turned to her slowly, meeting her venom with silence. "Your son is the one who benefits from this union," she replied evenly. "I simply survive it." Margot's expression hardened. "You're clever," she said. "Clever women rarely last long in this family." Claire smiled faintly. "Neither do cruel ones." Later that night, Ethan poured himself another drink as Claire stepped into the room, her movements deliberate. "So," he said, not looking at her, "we're officially tethered for 366 days. She nodded. "Unless you plan to annul it and lose everything," he scoffed. "No, I'll play along, but I want rules. No pretending, no intimacy, no—" "Deception?" Claire interrupted. He finally met her eyes. Something passed between them. An understanding. Perhaps even a truce. Jacob, now more curious than ever, began searching through old boxes stored in the West Wing attic. Most were filled with mundane estate records, but one caught his attention. A sealed wooden chest marked E.B. Inside were letters, torn photographs, and a lock of hair tied with a faded green ribbon. He didn't open them all. He couldn't. Something told him these weren't meant to be seen yet. Not until the right hands opened them. That night, Ethan dreamed of a girl in a white dress, standing beneath a blood-red moon. She whispered something he couldn't hear, then disappeared into smoke. He awoke in a cold sweat, his sheets tangled. The image burned into his mind. Meanwhile, Claire sat on the floor of her room, piecing together names and dates from Elizabeth's journal. One entry stood out: "If I vanish, I leave this truth buried under the year and a day." The next morning, Claire found Ethan in the sunroom, reading the financial reports with his usual detachment. "Your grandfather," she said, "was more romantic than I expected." Ethan looked up sharply. "You think this is romance?" She shook her head. "No, I think it's revenge or redemption, maybe both." He stared at her for a moment too long before returning to his papers. "Don't flatter yourself," he muttered. But even he wasn't sure who he was talking to. That evening, Margot hosted a dinner for select shareholders to reassure them of the company's future. Claire, dressed impeccably in navy silk, sat beside Ethan, playing her part to perfection. But beneath the surface, her mind was turning. She recognized one of the guests, an old man with a hawk-like nose who had once visited her mother in the hospital. His eyes widened when he saw Claire. He dropped his fork. She smiled at him knowingly. After the dinner, Ethan asked Claire directly, "How do you know Marcus Vane?" She paused. "He used to bring flowers to my mother every Thursday." Ethan frowned. "Your mother was a florist." Claire didn't answer. Instead, she walked away, her heels echoing ominously down the hall. Ethan felt a strange chill. His bride was full of closed doors, and each time he opened one, it led somewhere darker. Jacob found an old family photograph that night, hidden behind a cracked mirror. In it were Ethan, himself, Margot, and a woman with eyes just like Claire's, arm in arm with Elizabeth. The woman had been erased crudely, but not completely. Jacob stared at it for a long time. Something was unraveling, and Claire was the thread pulling it loose. He finally whispered, "Who are you?" Claire discovered the overgrown path by accident, or so it seemed. A breeze had shifted a curtain, revealing an old servant's door behind the tapestry in the library. She followed it through a narrow hallway, past a crumbling wine cellar and a rusted gate, until she stepped into a secluded corner of the estate. The garden beyond was wild and alive, overrun with ivy, weeds, and wilting roses. Something about it felt sacred, untouched by the poison of the Blackwood name. She wandered slowly, absorbing the scent of earth and memory. Statues leaned with age, and stone benches were chipped and cracked. At the garden's centre stood a sundial, long broken, pointing always west. Beneath it, Claire noticed loose stones. Her hands moved instinctively, brushing away leaves and soil until her fingers found it. A small, leather-bound journal, brittle with time. The name etched inside made her heart race. Elizabeth Blackwood. The first page was faded, but legible. They called me mad, said I saw too much, remembered too vividly, but the truth haunts even when buried in gardens. Claire sat against a tree, her fingers trembling as she turned the pages. Elizabeth's words spilled out in tangled elegance, stories of betrayal, secrets, and a love that nearly broke her. More importantly, she described patterns in the family, disappearances carefully concealed, and one child, born out of scandal, vanished from the record. As Claire read, a memory resurfaced. She was 9, sitting by her mother's hospital bed. Her mother's voice, weak but urgent, whispered, "The Blackwoods took everything. Don't let them bury you too." Claire had thought it was metaphor. Now she wasn't so sure. She flipped to a later entry. "They locked me away once, but the garden remembered me. She always remembered." Claire wiped a tear from her cheek. She wasn't just reading Elizabeth's story, she was living its shadow. Back at the house, Margot sat at her vanity, applying lipstick with mechanical precision. A maid entered quietly and whispered. She was seen near the west garden. Margot's hand froze. The lipstick smeared. "No one was supposed to go near it," she muttered. The maid hesitated. "Should I have her followed?" Margot didn't answer right away. Then, "No. Watch, but do not interfere. Not yet." Her reflection stared back at her accusingly. She adjusted her earrings, ignoring the tremble in her hands. Jacob noticed the change first. Claire seemed more centered, more deliberate. During breakfast, she asked pointed questions about family lineage. When Ethan laughed dismissively, she smiled. "Funny, you seem to know so little about where you come from." Ethan, offended, snapped back. "And you seem to know too much." Claire simply sipped her tea, leaving a silence he couldn't fill. Jacob watched it all, increasingly convinced that Claire wasn't just another outsider. She belonged to this house more than they knew. Later that day, Claire returned to the garden with gloves and pruning shears. She worked in silence, cutting back vines and uncovering half-buried stone pathways. It was less about gardening and more about resurrection. As she cleared a patch beneath an old elm, she uncovered another object, a silver locket, tarnished with time. Inside were 2 pictures, one of Elizabeth and the other, unmistakably, her mother. Claire gasped. The connection was no longer theory. It was blood. That night, Claire placed the locket and journal in a wooden box beneath her bed. She stared at the ceiling, whispering, "They tried to erase you, but I remember." She didn't sleep. Instead, she wrote in her own journal, recreating Elizabeth's timeline, aligning it with her mother's final years. There were gaps, years, unaccounted for, people who vanished without obituary or explanation. Claire made a list. She would find them, one by one. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he wandered the halls, he often found doors ajar that he'd left closed, lights on in empty rooms. He blamed the staff, until he caught a glimpse of Claire in the reflection of a hallway mirror, staring at a family portrait. She didn't notice him, or maybe she did, and chose not to care. Her gaze was fixed on Elizabeth's painted face. She reached out and traced it gently. Ethan turned away, uneasy. Meanwhile, Margot received an envelope with no return address. Inside were copies of letters, old ones addressed to Elizabeth with handwriting that looked vaguely familiar. One line stood out. She said she had a daughter, that if anything happened, she'd find her way back here, back to the garden. Margot paled. Her fingers curled around the letter. She stood, walked to the fireplace, and burned the entire thing. But the ashes couldn't erase what was written. Jacob crept into the library after midnight. He had seen Claire emerge earlier with soil-streaked hands and something tucked beneath her coat. He found the tapestry, the hidden door, the garden path. When he reached the sundial, the ground was freshly disturbed. He knelt, touched the earth, and whispered, "What are you looking for?" He didn't expect an answer, but behind him a soft voice spoke. "The truth. Isn't that what everyone's afraid of?" Claire stood there, arms crossed, unafraid. Jacob rose slowly. "You know, don't you?" he asked. "Not everything," she replied, "but enough to know this family is built on more than money." The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting silver shadows. For the first time, Jacob saw her not as an intruder, but as something else. Something the family had tried very hard to forget. The letters were hidden behind a false panel in the garden wall, wrapped in oilskin and sealed with wax long since cracked. Claire found them on a cold morning, her fingers guided by instinct more than sight. The bundle was tied with the same green ribbon from the locket, brittle and faded. She took them back to her room and opened the first one with care, as though unsealing the breath of a ghost. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, urgent, trembling. They said I was unwell, that grief had poisoned my mind, but I wasn't grieving. I was resisting. Claire read the words slowly, absorbing each one like a confession. Elizabeth had been silenced, her voice buried beneath layers of Blackwood charm and control. The letters weren't just personal, they were dangerous. They implicated people, named names, and beneath the anger there was love, a deep, doomed love that had once promised to save her. Claire's hands trembled as she reached the fourth letter. He was not who they said he was. They used him as bait to trap me. I knew too much. I saw the ledgers, the hidden accounts. They blamed me because I threatened the only thing they valued, control. The words struck like a hammer. Claire knew exactly what Elizabeth meant. The more she read, the clearer the parallels became. Elizabeth had been framed, discredited, just like her mother. Ethan found Claire in the East Wing, seated in front of the fireplace, the letters spread around her like fallen leaves. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying to mask the concern in his voice. Claire didn't answer. She picked up one letter and handed it to him. He read it in silence. His face hardened, his jaw tightened. "These are old accusations," he muttered. Claire leaned in. "They're not accusations. They're history. Your family's history." He returned the letter with a slight shake of the head. "Even if any of this is true, it's buried, forgotten." Claire stared at him. "And you're okay with that?" He didn't respond. The fire crackled between them, illuminating the space where trust had yet to grow. "Why does this matter to you?" he finally asked. Claire hesitated, then said softly, "Because my mother died trying to tell this story, and no one listened." Later, Jacob slipped into Claire's room with a photo in his hand. "I think this is her," he said. The photo was of Elizabeth, holding a baby beside a woman with a haunting resemblance to Claire. "Your mother," Jacob added, "wasn't just a visitor. She lived here, briefly. My grandfather took her in when Elizabeth was—" He didn't finish. Claire studied the photo. The timeline matched. Her mother had always been evasive about her past. Now she understood why. Downstairs, Margot grew increasingly unsettled. Servants whispered more now, eyes flitting nervously. When she passed, she'd spent decades crafting an image, a legacy, and Claire threatened to unravel it all with old paper and fragile truths. Margot retrieved a file from her private safe, one marked EB Archive. Inside were court documents, psychiatric evaluations, bribes to reporters, and one contract signed with a trembling hand, Elizabeth's. Margot stared at it. Then, without pause, she lit a match and watched it burn. Claire, meanwhile, visited the West Wing, off limits, according to the staff, but the lock was old, the hinges weak. Inside, dust hung in the air like history's breath. She found a sewing room, long abandoned, where the scent of lavender still lingered. On the windowsill sat a box. Inside it, a letter not from Elizabeth, but to her, from Claire's mother. "I'll keep her safe, no matter what it costs me." Claire sank to the floor. Her mother had known everything. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The words in Elizabeth's letter gnawed at him. He had grown up believing his family's version of history. Elizabeth was unstable, her disappearance a mercy. But now, he wasn't so sure. He found himself outside Claire's door, hesitant. He knocked. "I need to know what else you've found," he said. Claire opened the door slowly, her eyes red but fierce. "Then stop denying what's in front of you." Together they pored over the letters, comparing timelines, locations, handwriting. Ethan's disbelief gave way to reluctant comprehension. Claire wasn't twisting facts. She was following threads long buried. "She was right," he muttered, "about the offshore accounts. My grandfather mentioned them once, in a rage." Claire nodded. "There's more. The journals point to a vault. Something sealed, something Elizabeth never reached." Ethan looked at her. "Then we find it. Together." The next day, Margot hosted an afternoon tea for select board members. Claire attended, calm and graceful, but her eyes never left Margot's. At one point, Claire excused herself and dropped a small envelope beside Margot's saucer. Inside was a single phrase, handwritten, "How much did you pay to make her disappear?" Margot paled, but didn't react. Her hand trembled slightly as she stirred her tea. The war was no longer silent. After the guests departed, Margot cornered Claire in the hallway. "You don't know what you're doing," she whispered, her voice razor-sharp. Claire leaned in. "No, but I know what you did." Margot's eyes narrowed. "You want to destroy this family?" Claire didn't blink. "No, I want to reveal it." Then she walked away, leaving Margot in a silence she could no longer control. That night, Jacob found Ethan alone in the study, staring at the fire. "You believe her now, don't you?" Jacob asked. Ethan didn't respond at first. Then finally, "I think we've been living in a story written by someone else, and I think Claire is trying to finish the real one." Jacob nodded. "Then let's help her, before the past decides to silence her too." The sky cracked, opened just after midnight, rain hammering the estate like a furious memory. Claire stood at her window, watching the storm roll in over the hills. It felt like a warning, or maybe a calling. She didn't fear the dark. She had lived in it too long. What unsettled her now wasn't outside, but the silence within the walls of Blackwood Manor. Silence before revelation was always deceptive. Ethan couldn't sleep either. The storm stirred something old in him, something buried. He wandered the halls restlessly, his footsteps echoing through the cold corridors. Then on impulse, he went to the library. Claire wasn't there, but the scent of lavender lingered faintly. Her scent. On the desk lay Elizabeth's journal, open to a passage about the storm that preceded her vanishing. "They came for me that night. The rain was deafening, but not enough to drown their lies." A loud crack outside made the lights flicker. Claire lit a candle and stepped into the hallway. She wasn't sure why her feet carried her toward the west wing again. Maybe because storms had always revealed things in her life. Her mother's final confession had come during a thunderstorm. Her own birth, she'd been told, began with a lightning strike that set a tree ablaze. Tonight, she felt something about to break open. They met at the foot of the old servant staircase, both startled to see the other. "You again," Ethan muttered, but not unkindly. "We're drawn to the same ghosts, it seems," Claire replied. "Or maybe they're drawing us." A gust of wind banged open a nearby door. Ethan grabbed her arm instinctively. "There's a cabin just outside the gardens," he said. "It might be safer until this passes." Claire hesitated, then nodded. She wasn't afraid of storms, but the truth didn't like to be seen too clearly either. The cabin was modest, mostly used by gardeners long gone. Dust blanketed the furniture, but the fireplace still worked. Ethan lit it while Claire set the candle down, their faces flickering in its light. For a moment the world outside disappeared. "Why did your grandfather arrange this marriage?" Claire asked, voice low. Ethan hesitated. "He said I was too much like my mother, obsessed with power, that marrying someone grounded might remind me of people." Claire laughed softly, but not with humor. "He didn't know me then." Ethan looked at her. "He might have known more than we thought. He insisted on you, called you the key to everything before he died." Claire's eyes flashed. "He said that." Ethan nodded. She looked into the flames. Then maybe he knew the truth and regretted how it was buried. For the first time, Ethan didn't resist the direction of the conversation. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the silence between them deepened. "You're not who I expected," Ethan said. Claire smirked. "Neither are you." He leaned forward. "You want vengeance?" "I want clarity," she answered, "and peace for my mother, for Elizabeth, and maybe for myself." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then maybe we want the same thing." It wasn't a declaration of alliance, but it was something. Claire stood and walked toward the old chest in the corner of the room. Inside were tools, maps, and a single envelope marked "For EB." She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter she hadn't seen before, describing a hidden cellar beneath the east wing. "They think they erased me," Elizabeth had written, "but even erased ink leaves a shadow." Claire handed the letter to Ethan. "Tomorrow," she said, "we search." They talked for hours, about the journal, the garden, the Blackwoods, about their shared sense of betrayal, though it took different forms. Ethan admitted he never felt he belonged to his legacy. Claire confessed she had never belonged anywhere until this mission gave her direction. They weren't friends yet, but they weren't strangers anymore. The storm began to ease around 4 in the morning. The fire had burned low, but neither had slept. Ethan looked at Claire, her face softened in the dim light. "I thought you were here to destroy us," he said. "Maybe I am," Claire whispered. "Or maybe I'm just the mirror no one wants to look into." Outside, the trees dripped with rain. The estate breathed, restless. Back at the manor, Margot stood at her window, eyes narrowed on the cabin light glowing in the distance. She clenched her jaw. "She's moving too quickly," she said to herself. She reached for the landline and dialed a private number. "Activate the archive. If she gets near the vault, I want it gone. All of it." She didn't wait for a response. The past had stayed buried for decades. It would not rise now, not without a fight. The next morning broke quiet, but tense. The storm had passed, leaving the earth damp and the air charged with a strange stillness. Claire and Ethan returned to the manor through the garden path, their clothes damp and their thoughts heavier than before. They didn't speak much, but something had shifted. Trust was no longer a luxury between them, but a necessity. Inside the house, the quiet was too perfect. Claire could feel it in her chest, like a thread pulled too tightly. While Ethan headed toward the east wing to investigate the cellar Elizabeth had described, Claire slipped away to the drawing room. Something about a portrait there had always bothered her. The eyes, the slight blur along the frame. She stepped closer now, running her fingers along the edge until she found a latch, a hidden compartment. Inside, she found an old photograph, charred at the corners. A relic someone had tried and failed to destroy. The image showed 3 young women, arm in arm. One was clearly Elizabeth, another was Margot, barely out of girlhood. And the third, Claire's heart dropped, was her mother, young, vibrant, alive. On the back, faint writing, "Summer of Secrets, 1987. Claire clutched it tightly. Proof. Undeniable, irreversible proof. Her mother had lived here, had been part of this family, had been erased from it. Meanwhile, Ethan pushed aside crates in the East Wing cellar, revealing a hidden hatch beneath the floorboards. It groaned as he pulled it open, revealing a stone staircase descending into darkness. He lit a lantern and descended cautiously. The air was damp and metallic. At the bottom was a narrow room filled with old filing cabinets, some rusted shut. He pried one open and found financial ledgers, letters, and coded communications, names of shell companies, offshore accounts, evidence of a legacy built not just on wealth, but on manipulation. Claire found him there minutes later, still flipping through documents. "Look at this," she said, breathless, holding out the burned photo. Ethan stared at it, jaw tightening. "That's your mother." She nodded, and she was here with them. Before everything. Ethan studied the photo again, brow furrowed. They always said Elizabeth went mad, that she made up stories. But if your mother was here, maybe Elizabeth wasn't mad. Maybe she was silenced. As they sorted through files, Claire found a document signed by both Elizabeth and Margot, titled Non-Disclosure and Transfer of Authority. But the signatures didn't match. Elizabeth's name was forged. "They took her name, her voice, her power," Claire whispered. Ethan stared at the forged signature. This could unravel everything. "If the board sees this," Claire cut in, "they won't, not yet, we're not ready." Across the house, Jacob sat in his study, staring at a photocopy of the same photograph Claire had found. He'd discovered it weeks earlier in a locked drawer belonging to his grandfather. He hadn't known what to make of it, until now. Something had drawn him to Claire from the beginning, and now it was clear. They were connected by blood, by truth, by the story no one wanted to tell. Later that evening, Claire found herself alone in the library again. She returned to Elizabeth's journal, flipping to the final pages. There, scrawled hastily, was a name she hadn't seen before, Hollowbrook. Underneath it, the place they sent me when I became inconvenient. Claire felt a chill, a sanatorium. If Elizabeth had been hidden away under another identity, then perhaps she was still alive. The possibility stunned her. Jacob joined Claire not long after, drawn by a feeling he couldn't ignore. She showed him the burned photo. "Why would they hide this?" he asked. "Because it shows the truth," she answered. "That my mother wasn't some outsider. She was part of all of this. She and Elizabeth, they were trying to stop something." Jacob looked at her carefully. "Then maybe it's time someone finished what they started." Upstairs, Margot sat in the solarium, the burned edges of another photo crumbling between her fingers. She'd known Claire would find the picture eventually. There were too many cracks to seal forever. Her only mistake had been underestimating the girl's resolve. She pressed a button beneath the table, activating a private call. "It's time," she said simply. "Make her disappear. Quietly. Permanently." But someone was listening. An old butler, Thomas, whose loyalty had long shifted from fear to truth, stood outside the solarium, hidden in the shadows. He'd served 3 generations of Blackwoods and buried more secrets than he could count, but what Margot had just ordered went too far. That night, he left a small envelope outside Claire's door. Inside was a key, a note, and a location. "Hollowbrook exists. Ask for Eleanor Hart." Claire stared at the note, heart pounding. Hollowbrook was real, and someone inside wanted her to find it, to find Elizabeth, to finish the story they tried to erase. The following morning, the Blackwood estate buzzed with an unusual tension. The staff moved briskly, whispering in corners. Something was shifting, but no one dared name it. Claire walked through the halls with purpose, the note from Thomas clenched in her fist. Hollowbrook, Eleanor Hart. There were answers waiting, and time was no longer a luxury. But before she could plan her next move, Margot struck first, at A family luncheon masquerading as unity. Margot stood at the head of the long dining table, her smile brittle, her voice unnaturally sweet. "Before we begin," she said, "I believe some clarity is in order. About our new family member." Claire didn't flinch. Ethan looked up, sensing danger. Margot gestured, and a man stepped forward, holding a folder. "Public records," she explained. "Police reports. Claire's mother was a criminal, arrested, twice under false identities, accused of embezzlement, fraud." Gasps broke out among the guests. Claire stood slowly, her face unreadable. "Those charges were fabricated," she said, "part of the cover-up to protect this family's secrets." Margot's smile sharpened. "That's quite a claim. Do you have proof?" Claire didn't blink. "Do you have proof that any of it is true?" For a moment the room held its breath. Then Jacob rose. "I've seen the records. They were altered, and the dates don't match. Claire's mother was working at a school during the time of the alleged crimes." The tension cracked. Margot's gaze flicked to Jacob, cold and calculating, but before she could respond, Ethan stood. "Enough." His voice cut through the room like thunder. "This family's history is full of missing files and convenient scapegoats. Maybe it's time we stop pretending we don't know why." All eyes turned to Claire. She met them with steel in her spine. "My mother was innocent, and she died protecting someone who couldn't protect herself." Later in the study, Ethan confronted Claire privately. "You should have told me," he said. Claire looked at him, her eyes softer now. "Would you have believed me?" He hesitated. "I don't know, but I'm starting to." Claire stepped closer. "Ethan, the only reason I'm here is because my mother wanted the truth exposed, not just for herself, but for Elizabeth, for the others. There's more. But if I told you everything now, you'd run." Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he said, "Then, walk me to it, slowly." That night, Claire reviewed her notes again. Hollowbrook, Eleanor Hart. She searched public databases, encrypted forums, anything that might lead her to the sanatorium. And then, a ping. An obituary. Eleanor Hart, recently deceased, former nurse at Hollowbrook, survived by no family, but the article listed a location, an old care home now abandoned. Claire knew she had to go, but not alone. She approached Jacob the next morning. "I need your help," she said. "I think I've found where Elizabeth was sent, but I don't know what we'll find, or who might be watching." Jacob agreed, without hesitation. "If they hid her, we need to know why, and if she's still alive—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. They both felt it. The past was no longer just lingering. It was roaring back with vengeance. Meanwhile, Ethan investigated deeper into the family's financial past. He accessed a sealed drive left by his grandfather. Inside were voice memos, confessions, regrets. One entry played in his headphones. "Margot went too far. Elizabeth was never insane, but she knew too much. And your mother, she was behind the whole thing. I let it happen. I let them disappear her." Ethan sat back, stunned. His hands shook. The foundation of everything he'd believed was crumbling. Margot, sensing her grip weakening, began consolidating allies. She called an emergency meeting of the board, proposing a change in leadership for the company's long-term stability. But whispers followed her, doubt growing in every corner. Old allies began distancing themselves. The photo Claire had found had begun circulating quietly, thanks to Thomas, who had mailed anonymous copies to key figures in the Blackwood Circle. Claire and Jacob prepared for their journey to Hollowbrook. Ethan met them at the gates as they packed the car. "I'm coming with you," he said. "You don't have to prove anything to me anymore, but I need to see it for myself." Claire nodded, handing him one of Elizabeth's letters. "Then you should read this on the way." It explains what Hollowbrook really was. Ethan took it without question. His loyalty had shifted, no longer to the Blackwood name, but to something truer. As they drove through the countryside, the manor faded behind them, a fortress of silence and ghosts. Claire looked out the window, thinking of her mother, of Elizabeth, of the quiet resistance of women who were told to disappear. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about rewriting history. Ethan glanced at her, then returned to the letter. His hands were steady now. For the first time, he was ready to face what lay beyond the myth of his inheritance. Miles behind, Margot watched the security footage, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They're going to Hollowbrook," her assistant confirmed. Margot turned to him. "Call the caretaker. I want that building sealed. Burn the records if needed. No one can know what was done there." The assistant hesitated. "And if they find someone still alive?" Margot's gaze turned ice cold. "Then make sure they don't stay that way." The Hollowbrook facility stood like a wound carved into the countryside, grey stone, black windows, and silence that stretched for miles. Overgrown weeds clawed at rusted gates, and the paint on the sign had long since peeled away. Claire stepped out of the car first, the cold wind catching her hair. Ethan and Jacob followed close behind, both quiet. There was no mistaking it. This place had not been abandoned accidentally. It had been erased. Inside, the air was thick with mold and memories. Broken furniture littered the hallways. Old patient charts were scattered across the floor, smeared with water damage. Claire led them with certainty, her mother's words and Elizabeth's journal guiding her. "The East Wing," she said, pointing. "That's where they kept the long-term patients, the ones they didn't want found." Ethan didn't ask how she knew. He simply followed. They reached a locked door at the end of a long corridor. Claire inserted the key Thomas had left. It clicked. The room inside was small, sterile, forgotten. But in the corner, buried beneath old sheets, was a steel filing cabinet. Jacob pried it open. Inside were records, handwritten notes, charts, letters marked confidential. Claire grabbed a thick envelope labeled E. Blackwood, Code 7 Transfer. Inside, everything. Elizabeth's admission form, signed involuntarily. Diagnosis, delusional paranoia, medication logs, and a final entry. Patient transferred to private care under authority of M. Blackwood. Ethan stared at the paper, his mouth dry. "She never escaped," he said. "She was moved. Hidden." Claire nodded. "And someone kept paying for her care, for decades." She turned to Jacob. "We need to find the payment records." Jacob rifled through the drawers, finally pulling out a bound ledger. Offshore. Accounts, names of subsidiaries, transfers to anonymous trusts, and each one traced back to Blackwood Holdings. Claire's hand trembled. She wasn't just silenced, she was used. Her trust was stolen to fund this family's rise. Ethan couldn't speak. He sank into a chair, reading the amounts. Millions siphoned from Elizabeth's estate, funneled through fake charities and offshore fronts. His grandfather's initials were everywhere. But Margot's were there too, and more recent dates. Ethan whispered, "She's still pulling strings, even now." In a locked drawer, they found a tape recorder, dusty but intact. Jacob pressed play. A man's voice crackled through the static. It was Arthur Blackwood. "If you're hearing this, then it's already too late. I let them convince me she was dangerous, but she was the only one telling the truth." Margot knew what Elizabeth found. She found the double books, the illegal accounts. She was going to go public, so we made her disappear. The recording cut out. Silence fell over the room. Then Ethan said quietly, "We have enough to bring." "Everything down." Claire shook her head. "Not yet, there's one more piece missing." She held up a transfer form signed 2 years ago. It listed a new location, a long-term care home under a different name, a false identity. They moved her again. She might still be alive. They left Hollowbrook in silence. In the back seat, Jacob clutched the ledger tightly, as if afraid it might vanish. Ethan sat beside Claire in the front, staring ahead. "You're not what I expected," he said again. "You were right about everything." Claire didn't look at him. "Not everything, not yet." But her voice held no anger, only resolve. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Margot's world was cracking. News of irregularities had reached the ears of the board. Whispers of offshore theft, of an undisclosed patient once tied to the family fortune. She denied everything, of course, but someone had leaked portions of the ledger. Margot confronted the staff. Thomas was gone. No note, no trace. She knew who had turned him, and she knew it was only a matter of time. In a final move of desperation, Margot called her lawyers and began liquidating hidden accounts. "If they come for me," she said, "I'll make sure there's nothing left to find." But someone was watching her now. Someone inside the company, loyal not to her, but to the legacy she tried to corrupt. A sealed envelope was already en route to regulators, containing everything. Claire, Ethan, and Jacob arrived at the new care facility the next day. It was clean, quiet, far more modern than Hollowbrook. They presented the documents. The staff hesitated, then led them to room 311. Inside sat a woman, frail but alert, her hair silver, her posture proud. She looked up and smiled. "You found me," she said, her voice weak but unmistakable. "I knew someone would." Claire fell to her knees. "Elizabeth?" The old woman reached out a hand. "You look just like your mother." Ethan watched, in silence, as Claire clutched Elizabeth's hand, tears running down her face. The ghost they had been chasing all this time was real, alive, and ready to speak. Elizabeth Blackwood's eyes held decades of sorrow, yet within them flickered the quiet fire of survival. Claire sat beside her, unable to look away. "They said you were dead," she whispered. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "In a way, I was, but not anymore." Jacob stood frozen by the doorway. He had never met Elizabeth, only heard stories, twisted ones. The woman before him bore none of the madness he'd been taught to expect, only clarity and grief. Ethan pulled a chair closer. "Do you remember what happened?" Elizabeth nodded slowly. "They told me I was a danger, that I imagined it all, but I kept records. I hid them." Her fingers trembled as she gestured to a small drawer in the corner of her room. Inside were scraps of paper, stitched together to form a diary. Names, dates, transactions, everything Margot had tried to erase. Claire turned the pages, stunned. "These match the ledger we found." Elizabeth smiled. "I knew someone would come. Your mother promised she would protect the truth. I thought she was gone, like me. But now I see she sent you." Tears welled in Claire's eyes. "She died fighting them. But she made sure. I knew who the enemy was." Ethan rested a hand gently on Claire's back. "We finish what they started, together." Back at the manor, Margot's power was unraveling. The board had called an emergency meeting. Jacob had shared selected pages from the ledger with trusted allies. Margot tried to claim they were forgeries, but Ethan walked in mid-meeting, flanked by Claire and armed with Elizabeth's handwritten journal. "These are not forgeries," he said, placing the diary on the table. "And she's not dead. I've spoken with her. She's very much alive." The room erupted in murmurs. One board member demanded a forensic review. Another insisted on legal counsel. Margot stood, voice rising. "This is all a trap, a fabrication, by outsiders." "Claire is not an outsider," Jacob interrupted. "She's blood. Her mother was family, and you knew it." Margot's composure cracked. "You ungrateful child. Everything I did was to protect this family." Ethan stared her down. "You mean everything you did was to protect yourself?" Later that night, Ethan and Claire returned to the cabin near the garden. It was quiet, a safe place away from the collapsing facade of the Blackwood name. Claire lit the fireplace. "She told me more," she said. "Elizabeth, about the vault, the original vault, not just where the ledgers were kept, but the one beneath the manor, where your grandfather hid the earliest records." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You think it still exists?" Claire nodded. "I think it's the final piece." They returned to the manor before dawn, slipping into the basement through the service entrance. Claire led the way, guided by a passage Elizabeth described in her notes. Behind a wall of wine racks was a second stone wall, false, hollow. With effort, they pried it open. A narrow corridor lay beyond. At its end, a vault door, rusted but intact. Ethan entered the code Elizabeth had written, his grandfather's birthday reversed. The lock gave way. Inside were boxes marked with initials, bound books, and one steel case labeled Founding Transfers. Claire opened it. Inside were documents detailing how the Blackwood Empire had been built. Fraud, laundering, coercion, names of victims, bribes, politicians, bankers. It was the kind of truth that didn't just collapse a dynasty, it scorched it to the ground. Ethan stepped back. "This is nuclear." Claire stared down. "This is justice." Meanwhile, Margot received a call. Her lawyer. "Urgent. They've opened the vault," he said. "And there's nothing we can do. The regulators are involved. Now." Margot stood silently in her office. Then, in a sudden burst of fury, she swept her desk clear. "You don't understand," she said to no one. "They can't take this from me. I built this legacy." But no one was listening. Her empire was falling, and there was no one left to hold it up. That afternoon, Claire stood before the board with Elizabeth beside her, supported by a wheelchair and a quiet dignity that silenced the room. "For decades," Claire said, "you profited from a lie, from a woman's silence, from stolen names, stolen lives. Today, that ends." Elizabeth reached into her coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. "I hereby reclaim my shares, my voice, and my name." The board did not resist. With Margot absent, there was no fight left. Ethan followed suit. "I'm transferring my control to a foundation in Elizabeth's name," he said. "We'll rebuild, not as a dynasty, but as a restitution." Claire watched him surprised. Ethan turned to her. "This started with you, but it has to end with something better." As the meeting ended, Claire stepped into the hallway, breathing the first true breath of freedom she'd known in years. Jacob joined her, offering a smile. "We're not done yet," he said. "But we're close," Claire nodded. "There's one more thing I have to do for her, for my mother." She held the locket in her hand. It gleamed softly in the light. No longer a mystery, but a legacy. The air inside the manor had changed. Gone was the oppressive silence, replaced now by a buzz of tension, as if the house itself was bracing for one last truth. Claire walked with purpose, the locket still clutched in her hand. She had retrieved every document, every ledger, every voice, except one, her mother's. That voice, lost to illness and years of fear, still haunted her dreams. But the past, stubborn as ever, had one final whisper left. Thomas, the old butler, reappeared that morning with an envelope in hand. "Your mother," he said, barely above a whisper. "She left something with me years ago, told me to give it only when the Blackwoods started turning on themselves." Claire's hands trembled as she took it. The envelope was worn, but intact. Inside was a cassette tape. A note attached read, "If they silence me, let this speak." Claire closed her eyes. It was her mother's voice. Jacob helped her set up the tape player in the study. Ethan joined them moments later, silent but alert. They pressed play. The tape crackled. Then her mother's voice came through, hoarse but strong. My name is Lillian Hart, and I was witness to everything. I loved Elizabeth. I watched them tear her down. They threatened me too, told me to disappear. But I had a daughter, and I needed her to know the truth. Claire stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. On the tape, Lillian recounted dates, documents, moments of violence. Elizabeth found the second ledger, the one with names of investors in illegal holdings. When she refused to stay quiet, Margot forged medical documents. Had her committed. I tried to stop it, but I was powerless until I ran. A pause. Then, Claire, if you're hearing this, you were never a mistake. You were my resistance. Tears slid down Claire's face. Ethan gently took her hand. Jacob looked away, giving them space, but the silence between them all was profound. This was no longer theory. It was lived truth. And now it had a voice. Ethan stood. "We release this," he said, "publicly. It ends here." Claire nodded, "and begins again. Clean." News spread like wildfire. The testimony, digitized and authenticated, was released to the media alongside Elizabeth's journals. Headlines exploded. Blackwood heiress silenced by family. Decades-old conspiracy exposed. Protests outside the company's headquarters followed. Lawsuits began. Former employees came forward. A former caretaker from Hollowbrook even confirmed Elizabeth's secret imprisonment. The web Margot spun for decades unraveled thread by thread. Margot, cornered, fled to one of the family's remote properties, but it was too late. An arrest warrant was issued for her role in conspiracy, fraud, and medical falsification. Agents raided the estate, seizing files, digital records, offshore account links. The press swarmed, and the Blackwood name, once synonymous with power, was now stained with betrayal. Claire returned to Elizabeth's care home, the tape in hand. "She deserves to hear it," she told the nurse. Elizabeth listened to the recording with silent tears. When it ended, she said only, "She kept her promise." Claire hugged her. "And I kept mine." The two women, one survivor, one avenger, sat in peace for the first time, neither needing to speak the rest aloud. Ethan watched from the doorway. He had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something more human, humility maybe, or reckoning. He approached Elizabeth. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I want to make things right." Elizabeth nodded. "Then don't rebuild the empire. Replace it with something better." Ethan smiled. "I intend to." Jacob brought good news that evening. The foundation paperwork was approved. The Elizabeth Blackwood Institute for Justice and Preservation would open within the year, using the remainder of the estate's wealth to fund historical truth-telling, legal advocacy, and protection of whistleblowers. "It won't undo what happened," he said, "but it might stop it from happening again." That night, Claire stood alone in the forgotten garden, where it all began. She held the locket to her chest. The stars shimmered above, just as they had on her wedding night. But she was no longer a pawn. She was the storyteller, the one who turned the curse into a chorus. She whispered into the wind, "We're not forgotten. Not anymore." And somewhere, in the deepest corners of the earth and memory, a story that had long been buried breathed again. The calm didn't last. After the release of Lillian Hart's testimony and the confirmation of Elizabeth's survival, public support surged. But so did backlash. Loyalists to the Blackwood name, old business partners and legal manipulators began circling like vultures. Lawsuits multiplied, investments plummeted. The empire trembled not just from exposure, but from the weight of its own rot. And Margot, she hadn't been found yet. Claire sensed it before anyone else did. The silence from Margot wasn't surrender, it was preparation. One morning, a package arrived at the Foundation's temporary office. No return address. Inside was a simple USB drive. It contained surveillance footage from months prior, Claire entering the East Wing, accessing old ledgers. The file was accompanied by a typed note. "You think this is justice? It's only the beginning. M." Ethan was furious. "She's trying to paint you as the manipulator now, a thief, an opportunist." Claire nodded, unaffected. "She's playing her final cards. She wants to fracture us. She's hoping fear will do what force couldn't." Jacob traced the IP address. Embedded in the file metadata, it came from within the country, a private server outside Boston. Ethan clenched his fists. "She's nearby, she's watching us." That night, Claire received a call from a blocked number. She answered without hesitation. Margot's voice, smooth and venomous, came through. "I gave your mother a chance. She didn't take it. Don't make her mistake." Claire was quiet. Then, "You gave her a threat, not a choice." Margot chuckled. "Same thing, dear. You think exposing me changes anything? Power adapts. It finds new names, new masks." Claire whispered, "Not when it's burned to the ground." The next day, the Foundation's offices were broken into. Nothing stolen, only files rearranged, some shredded, others tagged with red ink. Lies. Ethan tightened security. "She's baiting you," he said. Claire shook her head. "No, she's losing control, and she knows it." Meanwhile, Jacob unearthed one final recording from Arthur Blackwood's archives, a private confession that named Margot directly in the orchestration of Elizabeth's confinement and the financial sabotage pinned on Lillian. Claire played the recording for Elizabeth that evening. Her hands trembled, but she smiled. "Then I was never mad, just inconvenient." Claire held her gently. "You were dangerous, because you were right." With the recording authenticated and broadcast, public support erupted. Former allies of the Blackwoods began to confess, shielding themselves legally in exchange for testimony. And then, finally, Margot was found. She was arrested at a private airstrip attempting to flee to Switzerland, disguised, alone. When the officers approached, she didn't resist. "I should have buried her deeper," she muttered. They didn't ask who she meant. Everyone already knew. The image of Margot in handcuffs made headlines the next day. But for Claire, justice wasn't about spectacle, it was about silence, the kind that comes when ghosts are finally laid to rest. Ethan visited Claire later that night. He found her in the old garden again, seated beside the sundial. "We've done it," he said. Claire looked up, exhausted but calm. "Have we?" Ethan sat beside her. "We've exposed the truth. That was the promise." Claire turned to him. "But not the price." She reached into her pocket and handed him the annulment papers. "The year and a day ends next week. We should finish it." Ethan looked at the document, then back at her. "We've come so far," he said. "Not as enemies, not even just as partners." Claire smiled gently. "We were what we needed to be at the time. But now, we owe each other freedom." He nodded, quietly folding the paper. "Then let's end it right. No bitterness, only understanding. A bond formed in fire, not destined to last, but impossible to forget." Claire returned to the manor one final time with Jacob. They walked through the empty halls, now stripped of their grandeur. Paintings removed, records boxed, a shell of a dynasty. "Are you ready to leave it behind?" Jacob asked. Claire paused. "Not leave, archive. Let others study it so they never repeat it." She pulled down the last remaining portrait, Elizabeth's. "This goes in the new foundation, where she belongs." That night, a storm returned, eerily similar to the 1 month ago. Thunder echoed across the hills, but inside the care facility, Elizabeth slept peacefully for the first time in decades. Her story had been told, her voice restored, and Claire, standing by the window, finally felt the storm didn't belong to her anymore. It was passing, leaving only clarity in its wake. The legal countdown had begun. 1 year and 1 day. Claire had watched the calendar like a quiet observer, never needing to mark it. Every breath within the Blackwood estate had etched the time into her bones. With the dynasty dismantled and Elizabeth's name restored, the final piece of closure was supposed to be simple, but Margot, even behind bars, still had one card left to play, and Claire knew she'd use it. That morning, Claire received an envelope via private courier. No return address again. Inside was a check, 7 figures, and a handwritten note in Margot's script. Discretion, silence, departure. Consider it your reward. Claire stared at it for a long time, then laughed bitterly. She brought it directly to Ethan, who sat reviewing transition papers. He read the note and looked up, surprised. She's still trying to buy you off, Claire nodded. Some habits die harder than legacies. Ethan set the check ablaze in the fireplace without hesitation. She doesn't get the last word. Claire looked at him. She still thinks this is about money, even after everything. Ethan sighed. It always was for her, not for us. They sat quietly, the embers flickering, no longer needing the drama of accusation or confession. Then Ethan spoke. Claire, I found something in my grandfather's safe, something I haven't told you yet. He placed a small silver key on the table. He led her to a private study hidden behind a false wall near the East Library. Inside, a room filled with journals, personal artifacts, and a locked cabinet marked simply Elizabeth. Claire opened it with the key. Inside were medical files, letters, and a birth certificate. She froze. Her eyes scanned the name, Claire Lillian Hart Blackwood. Date of birth confirmed. Father unknown. But underneath, in handwritten ink, verified through internal testing, Ethan Blackwood Sr., her grandfather. Claire stepped back in shock. Ethan watched her. I didn't know, I swear. Claire clutched the paper. You're telling me I'm not just connected through my mother, I'm biologically a Blackwood, through him. Ethan nodded. Your mother. She never said. Maybe she didn't know. Or maybe she knew and chose. To protect you from it. Claire stared into the cabinet, the truth pressing like cold iron against her skin. Everything they did to her. To Elizabeth. And he was my blood? Her voice trembled. It changes nothing, and everything. That evening, Jacob joined them after reviewing the same documents. It explains why Margot was so relentless, he said. You were a threat by blood, not just through your mother, but through lineage. You could have inherited everything legally. That's why she wanted you gone. The marriage clause? It was a way to contain you. Claire didn't speak. She simply walked to the window and stared at the setting sun. The year and a day was almost done, but the reckoning had just sharpened. Later, she met with Ethan privately in the drawing room. After tomorrow, she said, we're no longer married and we both walk out clean. Ethan nodded. Are you sure? Claire offered a tired smile. We were never meant to last, but we were meant to meet. We burned something down together. Ethan exhaled. Do you hate me for my name? Claire shook her head. No. I hated what it stood for, not who you became through it. He looked at her one last time. Would you do it all again? She thought carefully. Yes, but this time I'd have brought matches from the start. The next morning, the legal advisor confirmed it. Claire and Ethan had fulfilled the 1 year and 1 day clause. Ethan now had the legal right to full ownership, yet he signed the control of the fortune entirely over to the foundation bearing Elizabeth's name. Let this be the only thing the Blackwood name ever funds again, he said. Claire stood beside him as witness, not wife. As they walked out of the building, reporters surged toward them. Claire held her head high. Ethan offered no comment. Their silence was eloquent enough. That night, Claire returned once more to Elizabeth's side. She handed her the birth certificate. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "So he—" Claire nodded. "Yes." Elizabeth reached out, tears brimming. "Then you're all of us. The blood they feared, the legacy they tried to erase. And you survived." Claire whispered, "No, we did." In a quiet room back at the manor, Claire packed the last of her belongings. She passed the grand mirrors without glancing, left the hallways without nostalgia. When she reached the garden one last time, she knelt by the sundial and buried the birth certificate beneath the stone. Not out of shame, but as closure. It didn't define her, it never had. And then she left just as she had arrived, quietly, with purpose, under a sky that now finally felt like hers. Claire stood outside the care facility one last time, the wind soft against her face. Spring had begun to warm the edges of winter, and with it came a sense of thaw, of things long frozen finally breaking loose. She walked slowly inside, carrying a folder under her arm. Inside were documents, photos, and, most importantly, a name. A real one, not forged, not erased. She was here to deliver it to the one who'd been denied it the longest, Elizabeth. The old woman sat by the window, pale sunlight tracing the silver of her hair. When she turned and saw Claire, her expression lit with something more than recognition, something like peace. "You came," she said softly. Claire smiled. "With answers?" She handed Elizabeth the folder, watching as trembling hands opened it. Birth certificate, ledgers, confession transcripts. A statement from Margot's lawyer confirming her full admission of guilt. Elizabeth whispered, "It's real, all of it." Elizabeth read in silence for minutes that stretched long. Then, finally, she looked up. "It's over then?" Claire shook her head gently. "No, it's remembered. That's better." Elizabeth chuckled, though her eyes brimmed with tears. "Then tell me, child, what happens to us now?" Claire paused before answering. "We live. That's the final rebellion." And in that moment, they were no longer fragments of a shattered legacy. They were survivors, stitched together by truth. Meanwhile, Ethan finalized the dissolution of Blackwood Holdings as a private corporation. What remained was restructured under public trust, overseen by legal and ethical advisors. Not heirs. The board had disbanded. The shareholders paid in restitution from liquidated assets. For the first time, the Blackwood fortune was no longer a fortress. It was a foundation. "It'll never erase the damage," Ethan had said to the press, "but it can prevent the next silence." Jacob led a group of historians through the estate archives, preparing exhibits for the Elizabeth Blackwood Institute. The centerpiece? A reconstructed library, filled with the original journals, ledgers, and photographs of a woman once deemed insane, now revered as a truth-teller. "The past doesn't belong to the powerful," Jacob said during a press event. "It belongs to the ones who dared to write it down anyway." At the opening of the Institute, Elizabeth arrived in a wheelchair, dressed in blue, eyes alert. Despite her frailty, Claire wheeled her through the front doors, past portraits of the Blackwood ancestors, but this time Elizabeth's portrait stood in the center, bold, unhidden, a survivor immortalized not for scandal, but for strength. Reporters snapped photos, applause erupted, and in the quiet afterward, Elizabeth whispered, "I never imagined I'd be seen again." Claire took her hand. "Now you can't be unseen." After the ceremony, Claire wandered the halls of the new building alone. The rooms were bright, the walls covered in memories once stolen from her. Her mother's letters, Elizabeth's notes. Even a small exhibit on the Blackwood fraud and the cost of silence. She found herself stopping in front of a single item behind glass, a torn photograph. Her mother, Margot, and Elizabeth smiling together. Whole, before the fall. Later that week, Claire and Ethan shared coffee at a small cafe. No press, no pressure. "I got the final document from the lawyers," he said. "We're officially divorced." Claire smiled. "Strange. We barely began." Ethan nodded. "But we ended everything else." They clinked cups in a quiet toast, not to love, not to endings, but to clarity. They were no longer bound by names or contracts, only by the strange affection shared by those who survived the same war. Claire returned once more to the garden. It had been replanted, restored. Roses bloomed again, ivy trimmed back. A bench now sat near the sundial with a plaque that read, "For the ones they tried to forget." She sat down, letting the wind move through her. Her story, once buried, was now rooted, not as a revenge tale, but as something deeper, a story of reclamation. Elizabeth passed a few weeks later, quietly in her sleep. Claire sat with her until the very end. The funeral was modest but public, attended by dozens touched by her testimony. Ethan spoke. Jacob stood with her photo. Claire didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence this time wasn't forced. It was sacred, and when the sun set that day, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a promise, one whispered across generations, now finally spoken aloud. The Blackwood name no longer cast a shadow. It became one, a silhouette against a sky finally clearing, its weight dissolved by the truth. In the weeks after Elizabeth's passing, Claire began to feel something she hadn't in years. Lightness, not happiness, not exactly, but the absence of fear. She walked with ease now, unburdened by secrecy. Her name was hers again. And what it stood for was no longer someone else's story. The divorce was finalized quietly, without fanfare. Claire and Ethan met one last time outside the courthouse. "Do you regret it?" he asked, not looking at her. Claire thought for a moment. Not a second. Not because of what we were, but because of what we ended. He nodded, slipping the ring from his finger and placing it in her hand. "Keep it, as a reminder that sometimes contracts can undo curses." She smiled. "Or expose them." Jacob remained involved with the Institute, overseeing its growth into an international beacon for justice through memory. He often emailed Claire updates, always signing off with "still digging." She found comfort in knowing that some stories never truly close. They echo, they ripple, and someone always listens. She knew now the most dangerous kind of silence was the one no one noticed. That would never happen again. Claire moved into a modest home outside the city, nothing grand, just hers. She planted a garden in the back, filled with roses and ivy and lavender. Every spring, she planned to cut a few stems and leave them by the plaque in the Institute's courtyard. Lillian Hart. She remembered. A simple tribute to a woman who had died unheard, yet started everything with a single act of resistance. Raising a daughter to see what others ignored. One afternoon, as the sky threatened rain, Claire visited the Institute. She walked past the portraits, the displays, and paused by a new edition, a handwritten note from Elizabeth encased in glass. It read, "They didn't erase me, they just underestimated how long I could wait." Claire smiled, pressing her hand to the glass. "We waited too," she whispered, "but we're here now." Afterward, she walked to a nearby hilltop and watched the storm roll in. No fear, just awe. She thought of everything that had passed, the marriage, the deception, the discoveries, and the healing. She had entered the Blackwood estate as a mystery. She left it as the answer, not perfect, not untouched, but intact. Her story, once a whisper in her mother's dying breath, now bloomed like thunder across a world that could no longer ignore it. At home, she lit a candle for Elizabeth and her mother, not in mourning, but in memory, light against the dark, voice against silence. She kept their journals beside her bed, and sometimes, late at night, she'd read passages aloud, letting their words fill the room again, letting them breathe. One evening, she received a letter from a girl named Maya, 17, who had read Elizabeth's story through the foundation. "I never knew people like her existed," Maya wrote. "People who fought without being seen. I want to be someone who sees. Thank you for showing me how." Claire folded the letter, tears welling. The legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was growing in every voice that refused to be buried again. Claire took a final walk through the garden she'd planted. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold. She ran her fingers across the petals, paused by the sundial she'd recreated in miniature, and there, in silence, she understood. This wasn't about revenge or even justice. It was about remembering and refusing to forget again. If you've made it this far, let us know what you thought about the story. Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to subscribe to catch all our upcoming stories.